The intelligence battle JFK started but never lived to finish. There was a moment in June 1961 when the CIA realized the president was no longer on their side. That moment came on June 28th when President John F. Kennedy signed 3 National Security Action Memoranda, NSAM 55, 56, and 57, that fundamentally restructured how American intelligence operations would be conducted. The memoranda weren't requests, they weren't suggestions. They were presidential orders stripping the Central Intelligence Agency of its autonomous control over covert operations and transferring that power to the Joint Chiefs of Staff under direct presidential oversight. Kennedy wrote in NSAM 55 that he expected military advice to come to him direct and unfiltered, a clear shot at the CIA, which had filtered, manipulated, and distorted intelligence to serve its institutional interests for over a decade. The CIA had operated as an independent government within the government since its creation in 1947. It overthrew foreign leaders without presidential approval. It conducted assassinations without oversight. It ran operations that violated American law and international treaties, and it answered to no one, not Congress, not the courts, not even presidents. Allen Dulles, CIA director since 1953, believed intelligence professionals should make operational decisions, that presidents were too political, too constrained by law, too concerned with public opinion to fight the Cold War effectively. Dulles built the CIA into an empire. Kennedy was trying to dismantle it. If you want to understand how Kennedy's battle to control the CIA made him a target of the intelligence establishment and why that battle may have cost him his life, hit that like button. This is the story of the memoranda they tried to bury, the institutional war Kennedy couldn't win, and the president who tried to restore democratic control over the shadow government. Let's start with why Kennedy issued NSAM 55, 56, and 57, because understanding Kennedy's motivation requires understanding the disaster that preceded them, the Bay of Pigs. In April 1961, just 3 months into Kennedy's presidency, 1,400 CIA-trained Cuban exiles invaded Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. The operation was a catastrophic failure. Within 72 hours, Castro's forces had killed or captured almost all of them. American involvement was exposed. Kennedy looked incompetent, and the CIA's plan, developed under Eisenhower and sold to Kennedy as a guaranteed success, collapsed completely. But the failure wasn't the worst part. The manipulation was worse. Kennedy discovered that the CIA had lied to him about the operation's chances of success. They claimed Castro was unpopular and that the invasion would trigger uprisings. CIA's own intelligence analysts knew this was false. They claimed American involvement could remain covert. That was impossible given the operation's scale. They claimed the exiles could retreat to the mountains if the beach landing failed. The landing site was surrounded by impassable swamps. There were no mountains. The CIA had deliberately provided Kennedy with false intelligence designed to gain his approval, not to inform him of the operation's real prospects. And CIA Director Allen Dulles had structured the operation to force Kennedy's hand, believing that once the exiles were under attack, Kennedy would have no choice but to send in American troops and air power to save them. Dulles was trying to manipulate Kennedy into a full-scale invasion of Cuba. Kennedy refused to escalate. He accepted the humiliation of defeat rather than commit American forces. But Kennedy also learned something critical. The CIA could not be trusted. The agency had its own agenda, its own objectives, and was willing to lie to presidents to achieve them. On May 4, 1961, Kennedy appointed General Maxwell Taylor to chair a commission investigating the Bay of Pigs failure. The commission included Attorney General Robert Kennedy, Admiral Arleigh Burke, and CIA Director Allen Dulles, though having Dulles investigate his own failure was problematic, to say the least. The Taylor Commission submitted its report on June 13, 1961. The report was devastating. It concluded that the CIA had provided flawed intelligence, that the operation was poorly planned, that the agency had exceeded its capabilities, and that paramilitary operations should be transferred from the CIA to the Department of Defense. Based on the Taylor report, Kennedy issued 3 National Security Action Memoranda that would fundamentally alter American intelligence operations if they were implemented. NSAM 55, titled Relations of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to the President in Cold War Operations, was addressed only to the chairman of the JCS. Kennedy wrote, "I regard the Joint Chiefs of Staff as my principal military advisor, responsible both for initiating advice to me and for responding to requests for advice. I expect their advice to come to me direct and unfiltered." A clear shot at the CIA, which had filtered, manipulated, and distorted intelligence to serve its institutional interests for over a decade. Kennedy continued, "The Joint Chiefs of Staff have a responsibility for the defense of the nation in the Cold War similar to that which they have in conventional hostilities. They should know the military and paramilitary forces and resources available to the Department of Defense, verify their readiness, report on their adequacy, and make appropriate recommendations for their expansion and improvement." This was revolutionary. Kennedy was stating that Cold War operations, including covert operations previously controlled by the CIA, were now the responsibility of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The CIA was being pushed out of paramilitary operations entirely. NSAM 56, titled Evaluation of Paramilitary Requirements, directed a comprehensive review of all paramilitary operations to determine which agency should conduct them. The memorandum stated, "It is important that we anticipate now our possible future requirements in the field of unconventional warfare and paramilitary operations." This was Kennedy's attempt to prevent future Bay of Pigs disasters by ensuring proper evaluation of operations before they were approved, not after they failed. But NSAM 57 was the most important and the most threatening to the CIA. Titled Responsibility for Paramilitary Operations, established clear guidelines for which agency would conduct which operations. The key passage stated, "Any large covert operation, wholly or partly covert, which requires significant numbers of military-trained personnel, amounts of military equipment which exceed normal CIA-controlled stocks, and military experience of a kind and level peculiar to the armed services, is properly the primary responsibility of the Department of Defense, with the CIA in a supporting role." Think about what this meant. Large covert operations, the kind the CIA specialized in, the kind that generated institutional power and massive budgets, would no longer be CIA operations. They would be conducted by the military under presidential control. The CIA would be reduced to small-scale intelligence gathering and minor covert actions. For the CIA, this was an existential threat. The agency had been built on conducting major operations: the 1953 Iran coup, the 1954 Guatemala coup, attempted Castro assassinations, operations in Laos and Vietnam. These operations gave the CIA power, prestige, and justification for its budget. If NSAM 57 was implemented, the CIA would lose its reason for existing beyond basic intelligence collection. Allen Dulles understood the threat immediately. So did Richard Helms, Deputy Director for Plans, who ran the CIA's covert operations. So did James Angleton, Chief of Counterintelligence. These men had spent their careers building the CIA into an autonomous power center. Kennedy was trying to destroy that in 3 memoranda. The CIA's response was simple: resist implementation. NSAM 57 required the CIA and Pentagon to cooperate in transferring responsibilities. The CIA simply didn't cooperate. They argued about definitions.
What constituted a large operation? What counted as significant numbers of personnel? What level of military experience was required before the Pentagon took over? These weren't good faith questions, they were delaying tactics. The CIA knew that if they could stall long enough, if they could create enough bureaucratic confusion, if they could make implementation so difficult that Kennedy gave up, the memoranda would become meaningless pieces of paper. And within the Pentagon, the CIA found allies. Certain Defense Department officials who had worked closely with the CIA on covert operations didn't want to see those operations end. They enjoyed the excitement, the secrecy, the power that came from conducting operations beyond congressional oversight. Colonel L. Fletcher Pravy, who worked in the Pentagon's Office of Special Operations, later wrote that many Pentagon officials actually supported continuing CIA control of covert operations because they had developed a taste for the special operations business. Kennedy faced resistance from both the CIA and elements within his own Defense Department. The institutional forces protecting CIA autonomy were more powerful than any single president. Throughout 1961 and 1962, Kennedy tried to implement NSAMs 55, NSAM 56, and NSAM 57. He appointed General Maxwell Taylor as his military representative, specifically to ensure the Joint Chiefs followed Kennedy's directives. He fired Allen Dulles in November 1961, replacing him with John McCone, an outsider who Kennedy hoped would be more responsive to presidential control. But firing Dulles didn't solve the problem. Richard Helms remained as Deputy Director for Plans, running covert operations exactly as he had under Dulles. James Angleton remained as Chief of Counterintelligence, operating his own intelligence network that even the CIA director couldn't fully access. The station chiefs around the world, the operations officers, the analysts, they had all worked under Dulles. They were loyal to the institution, not to Kennedy. McCone tried to implement Kennedy's directives. He issued orders requiring presidential approval for major operations. He attempted to reduce the CIA's paramilitary capabilities. He transferred some operations to the Pentagon. But he faced constant resistance from his own agency. Officers ignored his directives. Operations continued without his knowledge. And within months, McCone realized that the CIA he was supposed to be directing was largely beyond his control.
By 1963, Kennedy had concluded that reforming the CIA from within was impossible. The institution was too entrenched, too resistant, too skilled at bureaucratic warfare. Kennedy began discussing more radical options, breaking the CIA into separate agencies, stripping it of all operational capabilities, or even abolishing it entirely and creating new intelligence organizations from scratch. According to multiple sources, Kennedy told associates he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. This wasn't just angry rhetoric. Kennedy was seriously considering dismantling the agency. He had commissioned reports on restructuring American intelligence. He had consulted with advisors about how to implement such a dramatic change. And he planned to make CIA reform a major initiative in his second term, after winning re-election in 1964 freed him from political constraints. But Kennedy never got that second term. The intelligence battle Kennedy started in June 1961 with NSAMs 55, 56, and 57 continued throughout his presidency. Every major foreign policy decision became a battlefield between Kennedy's vision of controlled, accountable intelligence operations and the CIA's institutional interest in maintaining autonomous power. In Laos, Kennedy wanted negotiation and neutralization. The CIA wanted to continue its secret war using Hmong tribesmen. In Vietnam, Kennedy moved toward withdrawal. The CIA supported escalation. In Cuba, Kennedy pursued diplomatic back channels after the missile crisis. The CIA continued plotting Castro's assassination. In the Soviet Union, Kennedy sought détente and arms control.
The CIA maintained that confrontation was the only viable strategy. Every conflict reinforced the same pattern: Kennedy trying to assert presidential control, the CIA resisting, and institutional forces within the military and intelligence community protecting the CIA's autonomy. The people most threatened by Kennedy's intelligence reforms weren't just CIA officers. Defense contractors who profited from covert operations opposed reform. Pentagon officials who enjoyed working with the CIA on special operations resisted change. Anti-communist ideologues who believed the CIA was essential for fighting the Cold War viewed Kennedy's reforms as dangerous weakness. And within the CIA itself, officers who had dedicated their careers to covert operations viewed Kennedy as a threat. They had overthrown governments, they had conducted assassinations, they had operated beyond law and oversight for over a decade, and they weren't going to let one president destroy what they had built. On November 22, 1963, Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Within days, Lyndon Johnson reversed every major intelligence reform Kennedy had attempted. Johnson didn't implement NSAMs 55, 56, and 57. He didn't transfer paramilitary operations to the Pentagon. He didn't reduce CIA autonomy. He didn't break the agency into smaller organizations. Instead, Johnson expanded CIA operations. He gave the agency a free hand in Vietnam. He approved covert operations Kennedy had rejected, and he ensured the CIA emerged from Kennedy's assassination stronger than ever. Richard Helms, who had resisted Kennedy's reforms, became CIA director in 1966. Under Helms, the agency resumed autonomous operations Kennedy had tried to stop. Covert actions in dozens of countries proceeded without meaningful presidential oversight, and the vision of controlled, accountable intelligence that Kennedy had fought for died completely. Was Kennedy assassinated because of his battle to control the CIA? There's no smoking gun document ordering his death, but consider the pattern. Kennedy issued NSAMs 55, 56, and 57 in June 1961, stripping the CIA of paramilitary operations. Kennedy fired Allen Dulles in November 1961. Kennedy continued trying to implement intelligence reforms throughout 1962 and 1963. Kennedy planned radical CIA restructuring for his second term. Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963, and every reform Kennedy attempted was reversed within days of his death. The people who benefited from Kennedy's assassination were the same people who opposed his intelligence reforms: CIA officers who wanted autonomous operations, defense contractors who profited from covert wars, Pentagon officials who enjoyed working beyond congressional oversight, anti-communist ideologues who believed the CIA was essential for national security. Let's be explicit about what we're suggesting. The CIA had the means to kill Kennedy: trained assassins, access to weapons, control of intelligence operations. The CIA had the motive. Kennedy was trying to dismantle their institutional power. And the CIA had the opportunity. Kennedy traveled in open motorcades with security that could be manipulated. Multiple witnesses have suggested CIA involvement in Kennedy's assassination. E. Howard Hunt, a CIA officer who worked on the Bay of Pigs, gave a deathbed confession implicating CIA officials. David Morales, chief of operations at the CIA's Miami station, told associates, "We took care of that son of a bitch, Kennedy." James Angleton, chief of counterintelligence, destroyed evidence and manipulated the assassination investigation.
These aren't random conspiracy theories. These are statements from CIA officers who had the means, motive, and opportunity. After Kennedy's death, the CIA's power not only survived, but expanded. The reforms Kennedy fought for were forgotten. The accountability Kennedy demanded never materialized, and the autonomous intelligence operations Kennedy tried to control continued for decades. NSAMs 55, 56, and 57 remained on the books but were never seriously implemented. They became historical curiosities, evidence of a president who tried and failed to control the intelligence community. Researchers who study Kennedy's presidency point to these memoranda as proof that Kennedy understood the danger of unchecked intelligence power, but they also demonstrate the limits of presidential authority when confronting entrenched institutional forces. On June 28, 1961, Kennedy signed NSAMs 55, 56, and 57, attempting to transfer control of covert operations from the CIA to the Pentagon under presidential oversight. For the next 2.5 years, Kennedy fought to implement those reforms against massive institutional resistance. On November 22, 1963, Kennedy was dead, and the intelligence battle he started died with him. If this story made you question everything you thought you knew about presidential power and intelligence agency autonomy, do something powerful. Hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube this suppressed history deserves to reach more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our investigations into the battles presidents fought against the intelligence community. Every day we uncover evidence hidden in declassified memoranda and forgotten directives. Stories of presidents who tried to control intelligence agencies, of institutional resistance that defeated reform, and of the price paid by those who challenged the shadow government. True history, true power. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment. Should the CIA answer to the president? Should covert operations require oversight? Are you in the US, Europe, Middle East, Asia? Our community spans the globe. Share your thoughts. Share your city. Keep this conversation alive. Thank you for watching, and remember, history doesn't repeat, but it echoes. The memoranda exist. NSAMs 55, 56, and 57 are real. Kennedy tried to control the CIA, and 29 months after issuing those orders, Kennedy was murdered, while the CIA officers who opposed his reforms remained in power, ready to continue the autonomous operations Kennedy died trying to stop. They called them National Security Action Memoranda. Kennedy called them presidential orders to restore democratic control over intelligence. And when the president who issued those orders was killed, the CIA got exactly what it wanted: continued autonomy, expanded operations, and freedom from presidential oversight for decades to come. June 28, 1961, Kennedy orders CIA reform. November 1961, Dulles fired. November 22, 1963, Kennedy dead. The question isn't whether NSAMs 55, 56, and 57 threatened the CIA. The question is, how far would the agency go to stop the president who threatened them? And after 61 years, we still don't have an answer, because the people who might have killed Kennedy, if it was a conspiracy, controlled the investigation, destroyed the evidence, and protected themselves. The intelligence battle JFK started in June 1961, ended in Dallas in November 1963, and the shadow government won.